I wanted to say a few thank yous, and especially to a couple of ladies who, especially this one lady who had lunch, she and I had lunch, and she said, you know, we should do something about singers so people understand more about what this is all, how you do what you do. And I said, oh, well, that's a great idea. And then she said, we could call it Singer Behind the Song. And that's what we did. And last year we had Sondra Radvanovsky here, and now this year, and we had Judith Forst, and we had Simone Osborne, and we're so happy to be able to continue this series. And the lady I'm talking about is Sonia Wall, who was so very, very gracious to make this all, this idea come to happen and to support it, and her mother Charlotte Wall, and I wanted to thank them so much. And there's another lady, Helen Hall, who also has worked tirelessly to make all this happen. So I'd just love to give those three ladies a big round of applause. And of course, we also have wonderful support from the Sheridan Wall Center here in Vancouver, because that's where we're able to host our guests in style, which is a wonderful hotel, and we're very grateful for that support. And then you see this beautiful piano. And this is showcase pianos that have the Fazioli piano, and some of you may not know about them, but they're marvelous instruments, and they're all handmade in Italy. And we're very fortunate to have the support of the showcase pianos and to let us have this Fazioli, which is really supporting our wonderful international artists. And of course, the Peter Wall Institute, we want to thank for their tremendous support. They've been with us from the very beginning to make this happen. And they also have been so kind as to give us a little break. About 1 o'clock, we'll take a little break, and you'll have some coffee and some goodies downstairs. And then at 1:30, we'll come back here, and we'll start a master class. And we're in the middle of a Rossini opera called La Cenerentola, and we're just in the last stages of the rehearsals. So we thought we'd have some of our singers work with Russell, because he's done so much Rossini, and as you hear, he's understands it back to front and sings so beautifully in that, and acting so beautifully. So we thought that would be great for our singers to do some of that, and then some of their other party pieces, and have Russell help them make it even better. So now I think we're all hooked up. Russell, shall we start this interview? Good. Okay. So I mean, for me, it's a great honor to have you here, and thinking that, I think it was in 1994 when he was in opera school, and I had just started to work as a stage director at University of Toronto. And it was just so apparent that this guy was going to Met. And I probably even said to you, I thought you're going to go to the Met for sure. And sure enough, I opened the magazine, and there he is. And what was that like the first time at the Met?
Apart from the fact that I caught the flu and missed about 10 days of rehearsal, this seems really loud, the microphone. It was fantastic, and I remember, I think, as quite often happens, somebody had pulled out of a contract, and I happened to audition not for this particular role, which was Falke in Die Fledermaus, which is the only opera I sang on stage here in Vancouver, the only role that I sang in that opera. It happened so fast, and I did really kind of see suddenly my future and my life change. I never really was a singer that had these set goals that I wanted to achieve by a certain time, and I think it helped me to grow very fast, the experience.
Yeah, sort of dumped in the pool and away you go. What was your first professional engagement then?
Well, In Toronto, you mean?
Yeah, when you started singing after operas.
Well, I think one of the first things, I was covering a few roles at the Canadian Opera Company, even though I wasn't technically in the ensemble, because I was always interested in doing art song and oratorio, and at that time I had started to already have a few little engagements, and they were so precious to me that I didn't want to sacrifice them for a commitment at the ensemble, and so I was covering roles like Marcello and Sid in Albert Herring, and then just after I graduated from opera school in '91, I had a chance to work with a wonderful company in Toronto called Opera Atelier that does Baroque-inspired productions, and we did a production of The Magic Flute, which occasionally they still unearth this production. It was so imaginative and wonderful to be part of. And then that next spring, I was double cast with one of Canada's greatest Figaros, Ted Berg, in a production of The Barber of Seville at the Canadian Opera Company. So those two roles, Papageno and Figaro, were kind of my first big roles. Yeah.
And you're talking about your love of art song, which we saw today, and you really just are such a stage creature. You tell the story of that art song so vividly. How did you feel like when you came to that? I know you have a special connection because you have a wife who is very much involved in art song. So tell us about that side, about how this team of two wonderful artists came together.
Yeah, well, we met in a piano vocal class at university in second year, and really through the music got to know each other, and then started dating it, and fell in love, and were married in '91. And Carolyn Moll is her name. She always was drawn towards the piano repertoire, the solo repertoire that required that special sort of poetic touch, like Schubert sonatas or Chopin barcarolle, Liszt und Sospiro, those kind of works that just express poetry. And so her coming to be a collaborative pianist, I think, was a very natural way, and I still love how her playing is poetic. And I think what the privilege, other than being, the vessel for these great composers and poets, is that when you perform a recital or an oratorio, you have a chance to really engage with the audience, which you sometimes, well, actually most of the time, cannot do quite as easily on the operatic stage. And by that I mean eye contact, and really sense a response from this eye contact. The eye contact is crucial in this kind of métier, and especially in oratorio as well, where the singer is really more of a medium of communication. There are, of course, very theatrical art songs as well that are performance pieces, but most of the time it's something that can only be said through the communication with each one, hopefully that you give a sense that you connect with everybody in the audience.
And of course, in a much more intimate space than an opera house, so that you can really see them.
It's not just the intimacy, but also, there's this void in between the audience and the performer called the orchestra pit. And I mean, that's being very negative about this space, but I mean, it can be also the most fantastic bridge. It's not necessarily a chasm, but it does. And then past the orchestra pit are the footlights, and that make it very, very hard to see beyond anyway. And so as an operatic performer, you have to use a different type of imagination than imagination is always crucial for performing. I think when you perform art song, it's the imagination that you can put the strength of your imagination into the visualization of the word. And when you are on the operatic stage, you use your imagination more into the establishment of relationships on stage, which are very important to communicate.
You were talking, we were talking before the recital about your portrayal of Louis Riel last May, and I had the good fortune of seeing that. I thought it was just incredible. What was your experience with that role?
Gosh, there's so many different levels of that. I was saying to Nancy earlier that there are a number of roles, maybe more than we really know, that sort of walk this fine balance between sanity and insanity, and or control and loss of control in those terms. And Louis Riel goes far into the extreme of his obsession with being the reincarnation of the King David, in a psychologically not very healthy way. So that was a real mental challenge, because it's also written, it's extremely difficult music, and it was written in a style that micromanages your performance, or at least tries to micromanage you as a performer, which isn't always the most rewarding, really, relationship between performer and composer, because the most satisfying experiences as a performer is when there's guidance and not micromanagement. I think that's the right word. And with Harry Summers, I kept having to just remind myself of my professional obligation to not only do what's on the page because it's mandatory, right? But also to really develop a kind of love for the music, which is not an easy step. And I've done a fair amount of contemporary music where the love part comes more natural, but it's our obligation to love the music, even if we don't, if we would not have written it ourselves, let's put it that way. Not that I could.
What's the role, the music that you really love when you're on the opera stage? I know you love the composers of the art song, and we should talk about that if you have favorites, but what would be an operatic role that you feel that love for?
Name any baritone role by Mozart. Those are, I mean, in my repertoire I've never sung Figaro, but I've sung Guglielmo, Papageno, Giovanni, and the Count, of course. And we'll soon sing my first Don Alfonso. To me, those are the most complete characters that you get to investigate as a performer, and they kind of go with you all through your career. Then there are two roles that really were particularly dear to my heart when I was younger, and one of them was Billy Budd, in Britain's opera called the same name, because it's such a pure and honest character who has such a profound effect on everyone whom he meets. Quite often we play characters that have a momentary effect on the audience and a momentary effect on who you're on stage with, but Billy Budd was one of those characters who has this kind of saintly radiance. If you know the opera a bit, you understand that. And the other opera, which for me was really when I knew I had sung my last Peleas, my heart broke, really, because that's a role that takes you through your youth, and the way it's written, if you have the voice type, which is sort of right in between baritone and tenor at the time, it can be just one of the most glorious experiences. But luckily there's another baritone role in that opera, and that's Golo, and I'm sort of in the process of merging into that as I get older. But that, I think, musically is my favorite opera, I would say.
And you're so, you have a real process about thinking of the role, not just vocally, obviously, as we hear you talk, but looking at it from all aspects, theatrical, historical. You have a process that these young people might like to know. Over here, I see lots of singers in the audience.
I think, of course, there's preparation is very important, but the process actually is to trust your director and trust your conductor. That for me is the most important process, because most of the time these two figures have an understanding of the work as a whole that you as an artist who's concerned about memorization, translation, diction, technique, physique, and all of those things, you get sort of focused on those things, but I think my understanding over the years of the repertoire that I've learned about is not something that I really learned by research, but I think I learned more by just openness to ideas that were foreign to my own.
So what has music, well, obviously music means a lot to your life, but could you ever imagine a life without singing, without music, without this whole, do you ever say, I wish I'd been this, or I wish I'd been that, or are you, tell us about
the operatic travel in particular is really, it takes a toll on you, especially, things in your personal life change all the time, and your responsibilities change a lot. And currently, we're looking after, the health of our parents. We're sort of in that sandwich generation. So I thought it would be easier to travel as our kids become, more independent. And as a matter of fact, both our sons might end up coming to UBC.
Just a good thing.
The older one has completed his second year at university in the States and is interested to come here partially because of the baseball program. And the younger one, the younger one also plays baseball. And so if you're a Canadian athlete, student athlete who wants to play baseball, UBC is the place to be, apart from the great institution of learning. But what was the question again?
I asked you if you'd like to have done anything else in your life.
Well, I don't think I can imagine a future where there isn't music or teaching and performing in it. There are other places to perform than, the big operatic stages that are very, very satisfying. And as I said, the operatic travel, due to its length, is just something that I think I've done my share of, and yeah.
And are you enjoying your congratulations, by the way, because you're won an award from the Royal Conservatory, right, in Toronto, which is great. It's a fellow there, and that's quite an institution of learning, and for many, many years in Toronto. And I know it had an influence on you when you were I love the story. The first thing you did when you moved from Germany was where you went to the conservatory, your mom and dad and your sister, and got teachers, music teachers, to start music right after immigrating to Canada. So now you've started to teach somewhat. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that has how that affects you?
Well, I've been teaching actually for a really long time. My wife Carolyn was assistant to a wonderful teacher in Toronto called Greta Kraus. I don't know if anybody remembers her. And Carolyn was her assistant. And then when Greta's health failed and she was teaching until she was 90, in that year where she passed away, someone needed to continue that course. And that was in 97, 98. So I hopped in very quickly because I was around to teach this leader course at U of T. And then over the years, Lorna MacDonald, who was head of the voice department, often asked me to come back and do a visiting teacher. At that point, you know, I was going pretty much from opera to opera. But then in the last 10 years, it was more formalized, so I'm actually on staff at U of T. But I've done that. I see a number of former students from the opera school. I really, really love teaching, and I love the passion and the potential for positive energy. And I've also had the chance, I've had this secret passion to conduct for a really long time, and the U of T is really supportive that way. At last, just over a year ago, I conducted a production of Orpheus in the Underworld, which was Matt was in. So I can branch out as, branch out not really, because I'm not really pursuing a career as a conductor. So, you know, but just to grow and to have that opportunity to develop is something that really I feel very privileged to have the chance to do.
Good. And we should get back to Art Song too, about your favorite repertoire, or do you have a favorite? Because you have such a wealth of repertoire in that area too.
I can't really say that I have a favorite. I am repeatedly drawn to Schubert, just because of sometimes the simplicity of his writing is just so profound. And I mean, talk about trusting your performer. It's really, it's such a gift. You really feel that you're in relationship with the composer when that happens. That's why I will never ever stop singing Bach either. I mean, for me, Bach is the most liberating composer there is, because the only information that is there are the abstract notes, and the rest of the guidance comes from an understanding of those notes and from an incredible trust that he must have had in his performers, because it's just notes. It's phenomenal, yeah.
But how did you come to that? Were you just naturally drawn to the Bach? Because there is no guidance there, right?
Yeah.
And
through my piano studies, which I did quite extensively in Germany, and then continued for 3 or 4 years quite seriously when we moved back to Canada. I found studying the Bach preludes and fugues always the most satisfying thing. Just the complexity of them and the concentration of the concept of them as a whole is just it's just wonderful. So I think if I had a composer whose music I had to live with on a desert island, it would be Bach for sure.
Great. What else do you want our audience to know? Do we have any questions out there for Russell?
Let's see.
Yes.
Oh,
I saw you was 2 years ago in the Don Giovanni in Toronto.
yes.
And that was an amazing production, very psychological. Did you have any words about that one?
So she's asked about the production at the Canadian Opera Company 2 years ago of Don Giovanni, in which Russell was Don Giovanni, and it was a very psychological production, and she's just wanting to know from Russell what that was like.
Yeah, Don Giovanni for me over the course of my career has sort of had a very special place. I've never been the sort of typical Don Giovanni singer, either vocally or physically, really. And well, not typical, I wouldn't say, but the sort of what the expectation of Don Giovanni has become through the 90s and the 2000s. And so the chance to do this opera, which I knew in advance, of course, it's some productions you are given the choice if it's a very unusual concept for a production, you're given a choice to have either to consult a video or to find out information beforehand. And I saw this video from Aix-en-Provence, and it was performed by Boje Skofus, a wonderful Danish, I think, is he Danish? Baritone who sung his career, almost his entire career in Vienna. And it was so, the concept of this role was for someone who is older, I'm 52 now, and I think, so I was 50, just about 50, almost 50 then. And this production really fascinated me because it presented a powerful man who exerts more power psychologically over everyone, really, not just the women, than physically sort of domineering. But having said that, I did this production first in Madrid, and I came the closest to just leaving because really to do the most unprofessional thing, because it was just torturesome to every day walk this incredibly intense psychological path. And also our director was very, very difficult to deal with personally. So some of those challenges can become overwhelming, but I'm really glad I stuck through it in Madrid and had a chance to do it in Toronto, where I think it was more successful, partially because, in Madrid, really, I was a nobody, and there was an expectation of, Don Giovanni in Madrid that for me to do Don Giovanni in Toronto was not there, because I'm really blessed to have a relationship with the audience in Toronto that is kind of, let's say, forgiving. That must have been a very difficult time, because you are never someone who would leave anywhere. So, but that's part of our business, isn't it? It's big, strong personalities on all sides. Anybody else have a question for Russell? Oh, yes, way back there.
I'm wondering what your most difficult role was.
My what?
I couldn't hear.
I'm wondering what your most difficult role was.
Most difficult.
The most difficult role.
Yeah, I would definitely say Louis Riel is by far the most difficult role that I've learned, and I found it almost impossible to work on anything else during this whole period that I was doing Louis Riel, and it was from it went to Ottawa and then it went to Quebec City, and by the end of July I was finally able to put this music aside. And I say finally because I had so much other music to learn at that time, and I could not focus on anything else except Louis Riel. It was kind of an obsession. So that that I think was the most difficult. I think for a young baritone, and very often it's interesting and wonderful to have a young baritone sing Count Almaviva in The Marriage of Figaro, and I found that extremely difficult because it's the first time that you kind of deal with a kind of rage as being introduced to this kind of unrestrained rage that Almaviva needs to be able to exhibit. And as a young singer, that is such a potentially dangerous situation, because before you know it, you're in somebody else's shoes. That you have to be very careful as a young lyric baritone singing that role. Just advice to any young lyric baritones: don't not sing it, but just be careful that the anger doesn't overtake you and make you not be able to play your instrument.